So in this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make fabric paper. And fabric paper is really cool because once you put this whole thing together, there is a flexibility to this where you can actually wrap it around journals. And it has this really interesting texture because you're actually collaging a bunch of different types of papers on there. And then because of the cheesecloth, this is actually, I'll show you how you do this, but you are going to be sandwiching cheesecloth between the papers. And because it's the cheesecloth, it is flexible and it holds its form. It's not brittle. So that's what's really cool about fabric paper, is that you can use this for multiple projects and purposes. So I wanted to show you a couple of examples. This actually is one that I already trimmed, but what happens is this is what it looks like when it's done. You still have a little bit of the cheesecloth hanging out on the side, but you can actually trim this when you're done for whatever project that you're going to use this for, or you can decide to have some of the cheesecloth hanging out of your cover. Like this one, I actually trimmed along all the way around, but then I liked that cheesecloth and I kept that hanging off. But I wanted to show you a couple of samples because you can see in here I have a couple of different things going on. I have paper, I had a lot of mulberry paper, and I have some collage paper, Asian text paper that I put in there. And then you can play around with color schemes, which is really cool. And that's what's really fun, is that you can actually play around with putting different materials. So let's go ahead and get started, and I'm going to go over the materials that you will need. You want a variety of tissue paper, handmade paper. This is a collection of mulberry paper that I have. You do want to keep in mind that you want to keep this thin because you do want that Mod Podge to be able to absorb through the paper. If it is too thick, like this, it also doesn't make your paper fabric flexible. So you want to make sure you stay somewhat thin with your papers. Now, this is just something I did. I went ahead and painted tissue paper with watercolor paint, just to give it some color. But by the time that you glue this on your fabric paper, it'll just look really interesting. So I have some tissue paper and some tissue paper that I actually painted here. Also, what I did is I took like the tissue paper that the sewing patterns are printed on, and I even added a little bit of color onto that paper, and that really makes for some interesting patterns and gives it a little bit of color. So you can use this as well. You will need, another thing I almost forgot is, I'll show this according to, you can also put skeleton leaves in your fabric paper as well. So that's also something you might want to add. You want some cheesecloth, and make sure that you get enough, because you're going to need it to cover the entire width of your fabric paper. So make sure you get a full roll of this, and this you can get at Michael's. They sell it actually this much. And then you want to get just regular tissue paper, so that's going to be important, and cut down to the size that you want for your project. I actually cut this size down for a 9x9 art journal that I'm going to cover, so this is actually going to be the whole width of the cover. You do want to get either a silicone mat or some saran wrap. And the reason why this is a really important part is that you don't want to work on your table, because we're going to be using so much matte medium, it's going to get stuck onto your table. So you need something that you can actually separate your fabric paper from. I found silicone mats work really well. Saran wrap works well too. So you want to make sure, if you don't have a silicone mat, make sure you put saran wrap on your workspace. And make sure that it is the full width of the size that you're working on too. So that's a really important thing. And also you want to have a roller, brush that actually has a big enough bristle so that you can have a lot of coverage, because we're going to be using this to apply the matte medium, and you're going to be applying a generous amount, so you want a brush that's wide enough. If your brush is too small, it's just not going to give you enough coverage on your tissue paper. So make sure that you have something large enough. And then you also want either matte medium, decoupage, Mod Podge is perfectly fine. You don't have to use anything expensive for this project because you're just using it to adhere everything together. And also make sure that you have a pair of scissors for you to trim any cheesecloth that you might need to trim to match your tissue paper. Okay, and also one more thing is make sure you have a hair dryer. This is going to be very important because you will be drying it as you're also separating it from the surface once everything is done. So that's going to be a very important thing to have. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so to get started, you can either put saran wrap over your entire work area, or like I found this silicone mat on Amazon, and this is really perfect for this technique. So that's what I'm going to use for this demonstration. And then you want to get a piece of tissue paper, and I've cut this down to size because what I want to do is actually make a cover for this journal that I put together. So I'm measuring this piece of tissue paper to be the length that will cover the journal. And then you also want to make sure that you have a piece of cheesecloth that is the same length as your tissue paper, cut to the same length. And it can actually be, you do want it to just hang a little bit, so make sure that you cut that cheesecloth just a little longer, because it's okay to have some of that cheesecloth hanging out. Plus, if you do want some clean edges, you can always trim it. Okay, so now I have my acrylic medium or Mod Podge or matte medium, and I'm going to start gluing the cheesecloth down simply by first applying a little bit of layer, and you want to be careful just to generously brush this on the tissue paper, because the more matte medium there is, the better it is when it dries. So you want to make sure that that is really covered. And then I'm just going to apply the cheesecloth just to get it started so it's adhered to the tissue paper. And this might be a little challenging to see since I have my tissue paper is off-white and my cheesecloth is also off-white. So you're going to work your way down on the tissue paper, making sure that you're getting that cheesecloth glued to the tissue paper. And you want to make sure that you're kind of straightening the cheesecloth so that there's not a whole lot of gathering of the cheesecloth on your surface. You're trying to keep this flat. So I'm kind of pulling this as I'm applying the matte medium over the cheesecloth just to get it to stay. And also to get it to straighten out. Now you're going to be using a lot of this matte medium, so don't be afraid to get generous on your application. And like I said, the more the matte medium, the better. Because when this matte medium dries, it's going to be stiff enough for a book cover, and it also, in a sense, protects it. It gives it almost like a plastic protection. So what you want to do is you want to continue this process until you have completely reached the bottom of the tissue paper and your cheesecloth is completely adhered to the whole thing. Okay, so I am going to start adding my collage material. Now, especially since this is wet, you don't really necessarily have to dry this yet. You can now begin to overlap your collage material on top of the cheesecloth. And because it's wet, you might be able to just apply it directly over the cheesecloth. If you have some dry spots, don't be afraid to add a little bit more matte medium. And also what I'm doing is, because a lot of these handmade papers and tissue is thin, I can use the bristles of my brush to actually press that down onto the cheesecloth. And the way that handmade paper works is that sometimes it'll go right through the paper and then you don't have to put a whole lot underneath the paper as you would normally collage down onto a canvas. And then you do want to alter, pieces of a variety of paper on here. And again, you don't have to be too meticulous on where things are landing. But when this is dry, it will not matter where it ends up. Again, you want to make sure that you don't have any folds in your paper, that it's staying pretty flat. I have kind of a curl up here. There we go. And then also, don't be afraid to tear your pages, because that actually gives you some character to the pieces. You don't want it all perfectly straight. And then also, if you feel like you missed a spot, you can always patch right over it. Just make sure that you have enough glue and it's still wet. And then also with my skeleton leaves, I might actually add them here. And you can just add more matte medium right over the leaf, because it goes right through the veins, and a skeleton leaf is pretty translucent. You just want to make sure you have enough in there to keep that in position so that when it dries. The main thing is that you actually cover all the cheesecloth. That's the goal, is to make sure to cover all of the cheesecloth with the papers. So what I'm doing is just adding a little bit of additional collage material in some areas. Okay, so now that this is completely covered with paper, I have one more little spot there I've got to cover. You can now thoroughly dry this with a hair dryer, and that's going to be the important thing, is that you thoroughly dry this before you try to remove this from your surface, which is the saran wrap or the silicone mat. Okay, so I'm going to take a dryer to this now and start drying this, and this might take some time because you do have quite a bit of matte medium on here, so you want to go ahead and start drying it pretty thoroughly. So one of the things you want to do is you first want to try to dry the top as much as possible before you start to lift this up from the surface. Because if you don't dry this enough, it's going to tear the tissue that's underneath the cheesecloth. So make sure you dry the top as much as you can before you start to separate your entire piece from the work surface. So now I'm going to start separating this, but I'm going to get the dryer underneath this so that it starts to really separate and dry the bottom of it. So that way it'll have a clean separation. I'm slowly peeling this off with the cheesecloth to make sure that the tissue paper does not stick onto the table and that it actually is not tearing. So be very careful when you do this. Once you have it separated, you want to turn it over, and this is where it's still really wet, so you want to make sure that you go ahead and start drying the back. So now that this is a little dry but it's still damp, I can take a roller to it to make sure that the paper is actually really stuck onto the cheesecloth. You don't want to do this when it's wet because it will get stuck to the table surface. So make sure that it's dry enough. And then because it's still moist, I have to continue to dry it and also continue to make sure that it's still separated from the silicone map or the saran wrap. So now that this is almost dried, and I do see some little bit of wet spots, so you want to make sure this dries a few more hours before you actually wrap it around something. But I wanted to show you now that this is actually flexible, right? So I can now wrap this around my Wabi Sabi art journal that I put together, and I'll be able to actually trim that and then maybe sew this, stitch this to the journal. But this will wrap really nicely because the cheesecloth makes it actually really flexible. So there you go.